Have you ever wondered what an ordinary person makes turning into someone capable of extreme acts? What I am going to tell today is not in traditional school books. This story remained hidden in the shadows of American history, deliberately erased by those who feared their power. In Virginia of 1858, a woman named Harriet challenged a whole system that imprisoned her. What happened on Christmas night was recorded in collective memory as one of the boldest acts of resistance during American slavery. The details I discovered after years researching almost destroyed documents will change your vision on the strength of the human spirit. If you value stories that reveal uncomfortable truths, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. Few know what really happened in the Willoughby plantation on that Christmas Eve. But today, you will be one of the rare people to find out how a single woman challenged generations of oppression and forever changed the fate of that property. The house still remains there, or what is left of it. The ruins of the Willoughby plantation, located in Albemarle County, Virginia, tell speechless the story that many tried to silence. Bricks blackened by the fire almost 2 centuries ago. The wind that passes between the broken walls seems to carry echoes of shouts, prayers, and the unmistakable glass sound shattering. Visitors report feeling a sudden cold in crossing what was once the main portal, even on the hottest summer days. The story that these walls witnessed is not just about revenge. It is about justice when the law does not provide it. It is about dignity when everything conspires to steal it. Harriet Reynolds was not a killer by nature. It was the system that turned it into one. In the ashes of this property was born not only the terror among the slave owners, but a whispered legend of cabin in cabin, planting in planting, the legend of those who dared to say, "No longer." What you will see today is a thorough investigation that reveals not only the facts, but humanity behind them. The currents of the chains are still there, as well as the table where the Willoughby family would sit for their last Christmas dinner. The story was not kind to Harriet. The story is never kind to those who challenge the established order. If you want to follow more cases like this which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. The Willoughby plantation was not small. It was extended for more than 300 in fertile land on the banks of the James River. In the center of the immense ground, the main house rose like a temple to power and wealth. 3 floors of red bricks, 8 white columns supporting a front porch where Colonel James Willoughby used to sit at dusk, drinking his whiskey while observing incessant work in the tobacco fields. The property worked as a small country, with its own laws and punishments. 63 enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset. The bronze bell, whose fragments can still be found among the ruins, played at 4 in the morning in summer and 5 in winter. Anyone who was not standing at the third badass knew the 9-pointed whip that the foreman Samuel Hicks kept hanging on the main barn wall. The smell of tobacco impregnated everything: the earth, the clothes, the skin of those who worked in the fields. The women had their hands permanently stained by the sticky sap of the leaves. The children, some only 6 years old, dragged themselves between the ranks, pulling caterpillars and pests that threatened the precious harvest. In the drying shed, the air was so dense that breathing became a fight. Men worked 16 hours hanging from the structures where the leaves dried at temperatures that often exceeded 100 degrees. The sound of the whip tearing the air is common as the corner of the birds. Every Friday, after weekly accounting, someone would be tied to the post in the center of the courtyard, an example to keep others on the line. The screams echoed through the fields, mingling with the occasional distant thunder. On summer nights, the chorus of crickets and frogs was punctuated by moans from the huts where the wounded were trying to find relief with herbal poultices. Meanwhile, in the big house, crystals tiled and pianos played. Mrs. Eleanor Willoughby, known for her refined cruelty, was proud of the parties she gave to the local elite. The contrast was absolute. A few meters away, completely different worlds existed under the same starry sky of Virginia. That year, 1858, winter arrived early. The first frost covered the fields in mid-November, an omen of what was coming. Harriet Reynolds was not born in the Willoughby plantation, reached the 17, bought in a Richmond auction after the bankruptcy of its former owner. Unlike most, he knew how to read, secretly taught by his First Lord's daughter before he lost everything to game debts. He hid this ability as a treasure, knowing that he could cost his life. High and erect size, Harriet had fine hands that indicated her previous occupation as a maid. Mrs. Willoughby noticed these hands in the auction and specifically acquired it to work at Casa Grande. Harriet became responsible for the 5 children of the family, 3 boys and 2 girls, between 4 and 15 years, as well as assisting in the kitchen and organization of frequent social events. This position in the house gave Harriet access to conversations, plans, and secrets. While serving tea in the salon, he heard discussions about people's sales, family separations, new, even more severe laws. When he organized the colonel's office, he saw documents that detailed the finances of the plantation and how each enslaved person was accounted for cattle and furniture. Among the enslaved people, Harriet occupied an ambiguous position. Some distrusted her for her proximity to the Willoughby family. Others looked for her precisely for this, hoping that she could intercede in her favor. Harriet was walking in this fine line with skill, never completely revealing her thoughts to anyone. On Sunday nights when I was allowed to visit the huts, Harriet took small gifts, a colorful tape for a girl, a piece of sweet bread to an elderly, medicinal herbs for the sick. Without words, it established alliances. He watched, listened, learned who was reliable and who was not. What no one suspected, not even those closest to her, was that Harriet dominated herbs knowledge far beyond the ordinary. His grandmother, torn from West Africa decades earlier, had been a respected healer in her village. Before being sold to another state, he transmitted to Harriet the knowledge of generations, which plants healed, which relieved the pain, and which one could kill without traces. Leave in the comments, never give up the truth if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The 1858 winter brought more than the cold to the Willoughby plantation. It brought a climb of cruelty that even the oldest had not witnessed before. Colonel James, pressured by increasing debt and a crop smaller than expected, discounted his frustrations in those who could not retaliate. First was Thomas, a middle-aged man who fell with exhaustion in the countryside. The punishment, 50 whip and an entire night tied to the pole during a snowstorm. They found him dead the next morning, his skin marked not only by the whip, but by the ice that formed about his open wounds. His wife Sarah was forbidden to cry. Who shed a tear would receive the same destination, warned the foreman. Then came the separation of the Jenkins family. The 3 children, the youngest at the age of 5, were sold to a Louisiana merchant. The mother, Ruth, threw herself at the feet of Mrs. Willoughby, begging that at least the youngest would stay. In response, Eleanor Willoughby ordered Ruth to be gagged and forced to wave farewell as the car drove his children. The following week, young Marcus was accused of stealing a piece of ham from the pantry. No one believed when he said Mrs. Willoughby had ordered him to take food to hunting dogs. Its punishment, have the letter L of an iron, marked thief on your forehead. Harriet held her hand during the procedure, her fixed eyes on her, absorbing every scream as if she were yours. On Sunday before Christmas, Jacob, a 12-year-old boy who worked at the stable, accidentally overthrew a bucket of water, scaring the colonel's favorite horse. The animal packed and almost knocked its owner. Enraged, James Willoughby ordered the boy to be tied by the thumbs to a branch on the ends of his feet for 6 hours under the cold wind. When they finally released him, Jacob could no longer feel his fingers. The doctor, called 2 days later when the gangrene had already settled, amputated both hands. Harriet watched all this not as a spectator, but as a witness. Each incident was recorded in its crystal-clear memory. His face remained impassive, but inside, something fundamental became. It wasn't just anger that grew. It was a cold and calculated resolution, a purpose. At night, alone in the small room at the back of the kitchen where he was allowed to sleep, Harriet looked at her own hands. Hands that served coffee in porcelain cups. Hands that helped Eleanor Willoughby dress with silks imported from France. Hands that put cold compresses on the forehead of white children when they had fever, while black children died of simple diseases in the cabins. The same hands that now closed on fists so tight that their palms bleed with nail marks. It took just one push. A last horror that broke the last barrier inside it. Diana was 17, the same age as Harriet when she arrived at the plantation. Born there, she was the daughter of Martha, the main cook, with whom Harriet worked daily. Quiet and diligent, Diana had recently caught the attention of the eldest son of Willoughby, Charles, 19 years old. Martha noticed the eyes and tried to protect her daughter, keeping her away from the big house. For a few weeks, you got it. Then 3 days before Christmas, Charles appeared in the kitchen looking for Diana. "I need her for special work in the library," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Martha looked at Harriet, powerless. Both knew what would happen. Diana returned hours later, the torn dress, finger marks on her neck, her eyes empty. He said nothing. I didn't need to. The next morning, Martha met her daughter hanging from a barn beam. Diana's body was buried without ceremony, in an unmarked grave, within the limits of the property. Colonel Willoughby considered the event an inconvenience and deduced Diana's salary value, responsible for not properly watching the goods. Martha didn't cry, not in front of others. That night, however, Harriet found her behind the kitchen, her body shaking in silent sobs. He hugged her long and firmly. When they finally broke up, Martha looked into Harriet's eyes and said only, "How long?" Harriet didn't respond with words. Instead, he removed from his neck a small leather bag that always carried hidden under his clothes. He opened it and showed Martha. Inside there was a piece of Diana's umbilical cord, which Martha had trusted Harriet on the day of the girl's birth, following an ancestral tradition to protect the child. The two women looked at each other in absolute silence. A sealed pact without words. Martha nodded once and returned to the kitchen. Harriet remained in the darkness, the tight little bag in his hand as he made his final decision. The Willoughby family represented only the visible tip of the system. Behind them was a whole structure that allowed and encouraged their cruelty. There was the Reverend Thornton, who on Sundays preached on obedience to you as a way to heaven, citing specific Bible passages to justify slavery. The same man who blessed the whips and sold to the colonel enslaved people that his own church had received as a donation. There was Dr. Preston, who treated the injured enslaved not for compassion, but to preserve the owner's investment. That kept meticulous records about which punishments left permanent marks and which allowed the slave to return quickly to work. Who performed medical experiments on pregnant women to test their theories about the anatomical difference between races. There was Mr. Hopkins, the lawyer who wrote the purchase and sale contracts, who knew the breaches in the few laws that offered any protection, which instructed their clients on how to legally circumvent them, who once advised Colonel Willoughby not to sell a mother and his daughter together, as separately they would reach a better price. There were the Neighbors, the Carrington, the Beaumont, the Whitfield, all nearby plantations, all participants in the same system, all frequent visitors of the Willoughby parties, all buyers and sellers of human lives as if they were cattle. And then there was Mrs. Eleanor Willoughby. While her husband was openly cruel, Eleanor practiced a more refined form of torture. He liked to present himself as a Christian and charitable lady. I read Bible passages to the enslaved children on Sundays. Occasionally he treated a sick with his own hands, and then used this kindness as an example of his moral superiority. It was Eleanor who suggested to her husband to separate families as a form of control. "They become more obedient when they have no one to resort to us," he explained during a dinner. It was Eleanor who implemented a system of informants among the enslaved, offering small privileges in exchange for reporting any suspicious conversation. It was Eleanor who prohibited any African cultural manifestation in the plantation, severely punishing those who were singing, dancing, or telling traditional stories. And it was Eleanor who, in the morning after Diana's suicide, called Harriet to her room and said, "It's a pity on that girl, so wasted. But you know how these people are. They don't have the same control over their emotions as we. It's their nature. Now we need to find another to replace her in the kitchen. Maybe that girl knew John's daughter. She looks strong enough." At that moment, looking at Eleanor Willoughby's serene and satisfied face, Harriet felt something break inside her. It was not an explosion of anger, but the opposite. An absolute, crystalline, almost transcendental calm, the moment the decision solidified beyond any doubt. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, with the same usual tone as always. "I'll see it is done." Something in Harriet's eyes must have warned Eleanor. as she slightly frowned. But the moment passed, and the lady turned her attention to the choice of the dress she would wear at the Christmas party, already forgotten the conversation. 2 days before Christmas, there was the incident that would seal the destination of the Willoughby family. The colonel was visited by the local sheriff and a group of neighboring owners. Rumors ran over a possible slave revolt in the region. Abolitionist pamphlets had been found in a nearby plantation. Someone was spreading dangerous ideas. One search was organized in the Willoughby plantation. Cabanas were turned. People were questioned under threat of torture. In Samuel's cabin, the blacksmith found a torn page of a northern newspaper that mentioned the abolitionist movement. Samuel swore he couldn't read that he had found the roll and kept it only because it was a rare material that could be useful. No one believed. The next morning they were all forced to watch while Samuel was whipped to death. 100 whipped, told aloud by the foreman. In the 15th blow, Samuel had already lost consciousness. In the 70th, I couldn't breathe anymore. They continued to complete the count. "This is the price of the insurrection," said Colonel Willoughby, walking among the ranks of lowered faces. "Remember this when you think of ideas above your condition." In the center of the first row, Harriet remained motionless as a statue. When they ordered everyone to go back to work, she moved mechanically to the big house. In the kitchen, preparations began for dinner, as if nothing had happened. Martha watched her. No words. He put a small dark glass bottle in Harriet's hand that had kept hidden in a false background of one of the large pans. Harriet immediately acknowledged him. It was a potent mixture of herbs, some secretly grown at the back of the cabins, some harvested in the forest beyond the boundaries of the plantation. The bottle disappeared on the folds of Harriet's dress. The plan, which until then existed only as an idea, began to take concrete form. That night, Harriet asked permission to visit the cemetery, the piece of land where the enslaved were buried. He said he wanted to pray for Samuel and Diana. Methodical. Willoughby, pleased with this demonstration of Christian piety, granted her an hour. Kneeling over the fresh land that covered Samuel, Harriet did not pray. Instead, he spoke in a low voice, as if he talked to the dead. "It is decided. On Christmas Eve, when they gather to celebrate your God that allows all this, you will be avenged." The final humiliation came on the eve of the planned day. The Willoughby family kept the tradition of holding a special service on Christmas Eve. All enslaved were obliged to participate, dressed in their best clothes, usually less thorough rags than usual, to hear the Reverend Thornton preach about the humility of Christ and the duty to serve. After the religious service, there was a ceremony where Colonel Willoughby distributed small gifts: a nut for each child, a cotton handkerchief to women, a dose of lower rum to men. Everyone should thank these gifts, regardless of how insignificant they were. This year, however, the colonel announced a change in tradition. Due to the ungrateful behavior demonstrated by the incident with Samuel, there would be no gifts. Instead, he would select a person to receive exemplary punishment as a reminder of what happened to those who did not value the generosity of his masters. The chosen one was Martha, mother of Diana. The pretext: a burnt bread served at breakfast. In the central courtyard, under the gray sky that threatened snow, Martha was tied to the post. His dress was torn to the waist, exposing his back already marked by old scars. Hicks has prepared the whip, wetting it in salt water to maximize pain. "First you will receive 20 whip," the colonel announced. "Then each of you will pass and thank you for the lesson you are receiving through it." Harriet watched her place in line. His normally expressionless face now could barely contain the inner whirlwind. When the first blow fell over Martha's back, something was definitely broken. It wasn't just Martha being punished there. She was her daughter Diana. It was Samuel. It was Jack Obe without his hands. It was Thomas killed in the snow. It was Ruth's children sold away. Each person who suffered and died under the yoke of that family. When his turn has come to pass before Martha and thank for the lesson, Harriet did something unexpected. He looked directly into Colonel Willoughby's eyes and said clearly, "Thank you for the lesson, sir. I will not forget her." There was something in the way I said these words that made the colonel's arrogant smile hesitate for a moment. But the moment passed, and Harriet returned to his position in line, head down, hands crossed over the apron. The perfect image of obedient servitude. That night, while dealing with Martha's wounds in the kitchen, Harriet first spoke about her plan. Not in detail, just enough. Martha heard in silence, then nodded only once. "Tomorrow night," Harriet whispered, "during Christmas dinner." The preparation was meticulous, worthy of a military strategist. Harriet didn't act on her own. She knew she would need help, but also that each additional person poses a higher risk of discovery. He carefully selected his accomplices. Martha, in the kitchen, would be fundamental. John, the coachman, who knew all the roads and shortcuts in the region. Rebecca, who took care of Willoughby children and had access to every room in the house. And finally, old Isaiah, who was practically invisible to whites at the age of years, just that old black man to serve something useful, as the colonel often referred to him. What the family didn't know was that Isaiah had been a respected blacksmith before her sale to the Willoughby plantation. His hands, although now shaking with age, still knew how to work the metal. For weeks, Isaiah had converted broken tools into small knives, easily hidden. John had meticulously mapped the night patrols and identified the best way to escape after the act. Rebecca had memorized the exact routine of each family member, including where they slept and how they moved around the house. And Martha had slowly incorporated small doses of the bottle content into the family's food, not enough to cause suspicions, just to make them slower and more confused when the time came. Harriet coordinated everything. In his little Bible, the only book that was allowed to possess, made coded notes on the banks, using symbols that looked like mere decorations to anyone who did not know the system. Every detail was planned. Who would be where, who would do what, how long they would have before the alarm sounded. The chosen date was not accidental. Christmas Eve ensured that the family would be gathered. More importantly, it was the night when the owners of neighboring plantations would be busy with their own celebrations, making a quick response unlikely when they discovered what had happened. Harriet baptized her plan with a name that never spoke aloud, but wrote once on the last page of her Bible, then pulling the paper and burning it. Exodus. It wouldn't just be a revenge, it would be a liberation. The countdown began. 7 days, 6, 5. Each morning, Harriet woke up with a clarity of purpose that she had never felt before. Each night, the deep sleep slept of those who are at peace with their decision. One day earlier, he gathered his accomplices one last time in the forest beyond the fields, under the pretext of collecting branches of pinheiro for Christmas decorations. There, with the sound of the wind in the trees camouflaging their voices, they have seen each step last time. "Tomorrow night," said Harriet, "we started a new story." Christmas Eve dawned with a dense fog covering the Willoughby plantation. From the gray sky, snowflakes began to fall lazily, promising a white Christmas, the perfect setting for the festivities the family planned. In the big house, the excitement was palpable. Mrs. Willoughby personally supervised the decoration of the main hall, where they would receive the most important guests for the festive dinner. Branches of holly and pine tree adorned the railing of the main staircase. Beeswax candles, imported from Europe, expected to be lit at dusk. The spice bread aroma, roasting and plum pudding filled the air. The kids Willoughby ran through the house, impatient to open the elaborately wrapped gifts who were already accumulating under the Christmas tree. Charles, the eldest, displayed the gold clock he had received in advance from his father. Elizabeth, 15, tried the new blue silk dress that she would wear at the celebration. Colonel Willoughby, in his office, tasted a brandy while reviewing the profits of the year, satisfactory despite the setbacks. Beside him, a newly pool pistol rested on the desk, a gift for himself, ordered especially from London. At the same time, less than 200 meters away in the enslaved cabins, a very different preparation occurred. Under Isaiah's command, small packages were discreetly organized, only the essentials for escape, some clothes, a little dry food, the few personal effects they had been able to maintain. John checked the harness of what would be his escape escort, 2 of the best horses of the property, which would pull a covered wagon normally used to transport goods. Inside the wagon, hidden under flour bags, were water songs, extra blankets, and a rudimentary map of the region, drawn from memory. Rebecca moved through the big house as usual, setting up rooms and taking care of Willoughby children, but her eyes recorded every detail with new attention. How many people traveled through each corridor, which doors remained unlocked, where the keys were stored. In the kitchen, Martha worked in the elaborate Christmas dinner. On his wrist, a thin recent scar, result of the punishment of the previous day, served as a constant reminder of the purpose of this night. With accurate movements, it incorporated the remaining content of Harriet's bottle into sauces and drinks that would be served exclusively to the Willoughby family. And Harriet. Harriet moved between these two worlds with the grace of those born for this role. At Casa Grande, smiled and made reverences, helped position garlands and polish. Occasionally, he crossed with the gaze of Rebecca or Martha, a brief eye contact that communicated more than 1,000 words. In the cabins, it appeared for a moment, whispering confirmations, calming nerves, strengthening resolution. When the property bell sounded 5 times, announcing the late afternoon of work and the beginning of the night festivities, Harriet was standing in the center of the kitchen, apparently supervising the last preparations of the banquet. In fact, he made a silent countdown. The guests started to arrive. Carriages stopped in front of the main entrance, discharging neighbors' owners in their de gala costumes. Reverend Thornton, Dr. Preston, Lawyer Hopkins, and their respective families. The men gathered in the colonel's office for cigars and conversations about politics, while women admired the decorations and exchanged comments about dresses and jewelry. The 7 hours marked the beginning of the religious service in the small chapel adjacent to the main house. All enslaved were aligned in the back of the enclosure, forced to stand while the family and their guests occupied the front seats. Reverend Thornton climbed to the pulpit, his resounding voice filling the space as he disagreed with divine goodness and the importance of obedience, a message that was little subtle to those who remained in the background shadows. Harriet watched her face a perfect mask of devotion. Internally, I counted the minutes. The plan depended on precise timing. When the Reverend finally pronounced the final Amen, they were over 8 o'clock. External guests said goodbye, committed to their own family celebrations. Only the Willoughby and their 5 children would remain for the intimate dinner that would precede the exchange of gifts. The moment had arrived. In the dining room, the tables shone in the light of silver chandeliers. The best porcelain, the finest crystals, the imported silver cutlery, all arranged with millimeter accuracy by Harriet that afternoon. 8 places, the colonel at the headboard, Eleanor on his right, the 5 children distributed along the table, and Reverend Thornton, who had accepted the invitation to dinner before returning to his own residence. At 8:30, Martha and 2 other women in the kitchen began to serve the feast. First oyster soup, then roasted turkey with cranberry sauce, followed by glazed ham with honey and cloves. Different wines for each plate, served in specific cups. For children, non-alcoholic cidra, sweetened with honey and cinnamon. Harriet did not participate directly in the service. As a supervisor, he remained standing in a discreet corner, noting to ensure that everything happened perfectly. His eyes captured every detail, as the colonel already looked slower as he cut his flesh, as Eleanor blinked unusual, as the youngest children yielded despite the excitement of the occasion. The herbs were taking effect. At 9 o'clock, when the Christmas pudding was brought in brandy-bluish flames, Harriet made an almost imperceptible gesture to Martha. It was the sign. Martha nodded softly and withdrew to the kitchen, where Rebecca, John, and Isaiah were waiting. The plan entered its final phase. The first to realize that something was wrong was Reverend Thornton. While serving on a second portion of pudding, he noticed that his hand 3 without control. He tried to speak, but his tongue seemed strangely heavy. He looked around and saw that the others also had similar signs. The colonel clung to the edge of the table as if he feared falling. Mrs. Willoughby had her eyes blurred. Charles knocks his glass, spilling wine over the white towel without even realizing it. "What is it happening?" Bulked the Reverend, his voice dragged and unrecognizable. That's when Harriet advanced from the shadows. No longer a submissive but erect figure, the eyes shining with an intensity that none of them had ever seen before. "Justice is happening," he replied, his clear voice cutting the silence that followed the Reverend's question. The colonel tried to get up, instinctively reaching the pocket where he usually kept a small pistol. Their movements were slow, uncoordinated. "How dares?" he managed to say before his legs gave in and he collapsed again in the chair. Harriet went calmly to the main door and turned the key in the lock. At the same time, Isaiah, John, and Rebecca entered the back, each carrying one of the small knives secretly forged. What followed was neither chaotic nor disordered. It was methodical, silent, and terribly efficient. One by one, starting with Colonel Willoughby, each family member and the Reverend found their end. There were no shouts. The herbs had made it impossible even this last expression of terror. Only looks of late understanding of absolute unbelief in the face of the instant collapse of your world. For each blow, Harriet pronounced a name. For Diana. For Samuel. By Thomas. For Ruth and her children. By Jacob. A long postponed litany. Eleanor Willoughby was the last. When Harriet approached her, the lady still kept aware enough to recognize her. "Why?" he managed to articulate, his face contracted in a mask of misunderstanding. Harriet leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Because we are human too." The silence that followed was absolute. The room clock marked 9:45 when Harriet finally lowered the knife, now stained with the blood of those who had stained so many lives with their cruelty. There was no celebration, no demonstrations of triumph, only a solemn moment of recognition of what had been done, not for blind revenge, but for deliberate justice. Martha entered the room, and without looking at the table and what lies in her, announced, "It's all ready." In the back of the property, 27 people, all those who had decided to leave, were waiting in silence by the covered wagon and 2 additional horses, children clinging to the hands of mothers, elderly supported by young people, all with the same certain looks. Before they left the big house, however, Harriet had one last act to fulfill. He collected the wax candles that illuminated the dining room and methodically began to position them at strategic points of the house. First in the attic, next to the document boxes that registered purchases and sales of human lives, then in the library, where leather-bound volumes rested on oak shelves, books that no slavery would ever be permitted to play. Finally in the living room, next to the imported velvet curtains. One by one, lit the candles and turned them, allowing the melted wax to fall over wood, paper, fabric. The small flames quickly found food in the dry material of the old house. "Come on," he said finally, joining the others in the back courtyard. "Our exodus starts now." As they walked away along the snow-covered road, they could see the orange glare growing behind them. The Willoughby plantation, that little kingdom of terror, dissolved in ashes under the starry sky of Christmas Eve. They didn't go to the north immediately. It would be the first place where they would seek. Instead, they went west by the secondary paths that John knew through conversations with other coacheers. The plan was to reach a community of Maroons, fugitive slaves who had established hidden settlements in the mountains of western Virginia. The way would not be easy. Winter made the trip even more dangerous. They would have to avoid cities, patrols, reward hunters, but for the first time in their lives, they went under their own direction. No more ownership, but people. Before leaving, Harriet had gathered all in a circle. From his neck, he removed the small bag containing Diana's umbilical cord. He placed it in the center of a piece of white cloth, along with a land collected from Samuel's grave and a fragment of the whip used against Martha. "We took with us the memory of those who stayed," he said, tying the bundle cloth, "and we left behind the past that was imposed on us." The simple ritual had sealed its collective pact. They weren't just fugitives. They were deep pains of a new story. The news of what happened at the Willoughby plantation on Christmas Eve 1858 spread as a dry straw fire. First, through the terrified accounts of the few enslaved ones who chose to stay, those too old for the journey or who feared reprisals against family members in other plantations. Then by the initially local, then state, finally national newspapers. The official report spoke of brutal murder and criminal destruction of property. The governor of Virginia sent a letter to President Buchanan warning of the dangerous precedent and requesting federal assistance to capture those responsible. Substantial rewards were offered by information leading to the capture of Harriet Reynolds, now described as a instigator of violent insurrection and threat to the peace and order of Southern institutions. In large homes of neighboring plantations, nervous letters were exchanged between owners. Some reinforced safety, hiring additional forever and installing more robust locks. Others sent family members to urban homes considered safer. In Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans, chattel conversations in the halls questioned, could it happen here too? But in huts and senzalas, in the kitchens and in the fields, another narrative took shape. The Willoughby method, as it was silently baptized, became a whispered inspiration from ear to the ear. No one talked about it openly, but the eyes exchanged among enslaved people carried new meaning. If Harriet and the others got it, it may not be impossible. In the following weeks, similar incidents, although on a smaller scale, were reported in plantations in Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia. A owner poisoned by his cook. A big house mysteriously burned down at night. A particularly cruel foreman found dead in the tool shed, a sickle buried in his chest. Authorities responded with intensified violence, more public hangings, more exemplary punishments, more restrictions. But the genius could not be put back in the bottle. The seed of the final resistance, not just escape or sabotage, but direct confrontation, had been planted. In Washington, the incident added fuel to the already inflamed debate about slavery. Southern politicians used it as evidence of the wild nature of Africans and the need for more rigid control. Northern abolitionists, although publicly condemning violence, privately recognized the despair that led to such acts. Frederick Douglass, in a carefully formulated discourse in Rochester, commented, "Although we cannot applaud the means, we must recognize that when humanity denies generations, we cannot surprise when the answer eventually comes in terms that humanity cannot applaud." Meanwhile, Harriet and her group remained her arduous journey. 2 children and 1 elderly did not survive the rigor of winter during the escape. They were buried with brief but worthy ceremonies, their names recorded on pieces of wood that marked makeshift graves, the first to receive such honor. In mid-February, they finally reached the Maroon settlement in the mountains. There they found a community of about 60 people, all fugitives like them, some living in freedom for decades. Rustic but solid huts, small protected plantations, a system of watchmen and signs to alert about the approach of strangers. They were received with initial caution, then with increasing respect when their history was known. Harriet, particularly, became an authority figure not for the violence she had orchestrated, but for the accuracy of her planning and the clarity of her purpose. The hunt for them never ceased completely. In April 1859, a Virginia militia, led by Colonel Willoughby's brother, managed to track the group until the settlement. What followed was later described as the Battle of the Black Mountain, a 3-day confrontation that ended with the retreating militia, having lost 8 men against 3 of the settlement. Among those who fell defending his newly contested freedom was John, the former coachman. His last moments were witnessed by Isaiah, who reported his final words, "Tell Harriet that I don't regret anything. I will die as a free man." The colonel's brother, seriously injured during the battle, was captured. Harriet personally served her water and treated her injuries. Not for compassion, he explained later, but to show the difference between his humanity and the cruelty they had suffered. When he recovered enough forces, he was released with a message. "Tell them that we just want to be left alone, but if they come again, they will find the same fate." It was the Latima organized attempt to capture them. The Civil War, which broke out the following year, diverted attention and resources for larger conflicts. Harriet Reynolds lived until 1896, reaching the remarkable age of 73, extraordinary to someone who spent half his life under the brutality of slavery. He never married, dedicating his life to the community that had helped save and later expand. After the Civil War, while other Maroon settlements were gradually absorbed into the larger society, Harriet's group maintained their independence. They eventually established limited trade relations with nearby cities, but preserved their traditions and autonomy. In the deathbed, Harriet gathered the original escape survivors and their descendants. "What we did on that Christmas night," he said in a weak but firm voice, It was not out of hatred, although hatred was there. It was so that we could live like humans. Remember that when they tell our story. In the following years, the story of Harriet Reynolds and Red Christmas of Willoughby has taken on almost mythical dimensions. In the southern black communities, it became a whispered legend, a symbol of final resistance when all other options were running out. Objects supposedly connected to the event acquired almost sacred status: a camascated fragment of the dining table where the act occurred, a Harriet Bible page, one of the small vials that would have contained the fatal herbs. No one could verify the authenticity of these items, but their symbolic importance transcended issues of provenance. Songs were composed, although never written, transmitted orally from generation to generation, with coded letters understandable only to the initiates. When the bell plays at midnight and the table is set with fine silver, remember who served the wine and who drank to the end. 13th century scholars tried to document the event with academic accuracy, bumping into the scarcity of reliable records and the oral nature of history transmission. Debates emerged. Was it a justifiable act of unjustifiable resistance or violence? How many people really participated? Did the mountain settlement really exist, or was it a posterior dumpling? For white historians, he tended to be catalogued as Massacre or revolt. For black academics, often as a liberation insurrection or organized resistance. But in descendant communities of enslaved people, history remained simpler and direct. It was a time when the oppressed refused to remain objects of history and rather became their subjects. A small memorial plate, installed in 1998 in the approximate place where one day there was the Willoughby plantation, contains only these words: "Here lies the memory of those who lived, suffered, and finally complained about their humanity. May their stories never be forgotten." On a silent winter morning, it is not uncommon to find fresh flowers deposited by this sign, brought by unknown pilgrims who still find, in this story 2 centuries ago, a powerful reminder of what it means to fight for the fundamental right to exist with dignity. If you watched so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Harriet's story touched her heart. Share so that Harriet's memory is never forgotten.